And I'm also going to turn on the captions, and you can turn those off or on by toggling the closed caption icon at the bottom of your screen. We'll have about 35 to 40 minutes for presentation. Dr. Foster will take questions of clarification as she goes, but please hold your substantive questions until the end. We'll have about 10 to 15 minutes for group discussion, and then we'll reserve the last 15 minutes or so, so beginning around 12:55, for a discussion between Dr. Foster and our trainees, a professional development conversation. So I think that covers most of our usual business, except I will mention that we have a late addition to our events calendar. Next Monday, we will have a presentation by Professor Mike Mueller-Smith from the Economics Department and a faculty associate in PSC, discussing new research findings on children's exposure to the criminal justice system using his administrative records data set. So we're really excited to have that opportunity to highlight his work, and I hope you're able to join. That the link for that was circulated last week, and we'll send out more information this week. So to proceed with my introduction, a little more information about Dr. Foster. Diana Greene Foster is a demographer and a professor in the Department of Obstetrics, Gynecology, and Reproductive Services at the University of California, San Francisco, where she is also director of research in the program on advancing new standards in reproductive health, and the director of the Bixby Population Sciences Research Unit. She led the Turnaway Study, which we'll hear more about today, a nationwide longitudinal prospective study of the health and well-being of women who seek abortion. And this includes both women who did and did not receive abortion, the abortion they sought in the United States. She is currently collaborating with scientists on an NIH-funded Turnaway study in Nepal. Dr. Foster received her undergraduate degree from UC Berkeley and her MA and PhD in demography and public policy from Princeton University. Her book, The Turnaway Study, 10 Years, 1,000 Women and the Consequences of Having or Being Denied an Abortion, was published in 2020. And she was the 2021 Harriet B. Presser Award recipient at the by the Population Association of America for the study of gender and demography. I'm very pleased again to welcome Dr. Foster, and I will turn things over to you. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you very much, Dr. Formby. It's really great to be here. I wish I was here in person. It's a crazy day for abortion researchers, and in fact, particularly for women in Texas. Today at the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court is hearing the Texas case SB 8, which bans abortions after 6 weeks of pregnancy, and it doesn't. The ingenious thing about the law is it doesn't require the government to enforce a law. It's enforced through civil lawsuits. So you can sue someone who you think has had an abortion after, not the person who received it, but anyone who helped them get an abortion after 6 weeks. This I just stole from the New York Times. TexPEP, people at the University of Texas, Austin, have been monitoring the number of abortions in the state, and it dropped by about 2,000 or 3,000. After starting in September when the law went into effect. And so it is super interesting to think about what the consequences are, and makes this presentation I'm going to give you even more relevant. So what happens? Did all of those people then decide to carry the pregnancy to term? Well, there's some other options. One is that many people went to Oklahoma and Louisiana and other states to get an abortion elsewhere. And that's probably particularly people with means did that. People with tech savvy probably got abortions through the internet. There are a series of, a set of websites where you can order pills online. And then some people probably traveled to Mexico to get abortion pills there. And then finally, some people, and we'll find out maybe starting in the spring, are carrying the pregnancy to term. So that's what's happening today. I've been trying to follow people blogging the case, and it's really hard for me to say what exactly is happening with it. It seems very complicated based on who gets to make decisions rather than the constitutionality of the right to abortion. So let me turn the attention to the study. This study was designed to address the question, does abortion hurt women? And the Supreme Court in 2007 ruled against one procedure on the basis that women would be depressed and have a loss of self-esteem if they received an abortion. So what is true about this statement in 2007 is that there were no reliable data. So there was a serious need for reliable data. But one other thing it raises is that if you're going to ban abortion on the basis that people who receive it would be depressed, then you really need to know, well, what happens to people who wanted it and didn't get it? So the reason why there's no reliable data is that it's actually quite difficult to study the consequences of abortion. And there are a set of studies, some of them are just among people who receive an abortion with no comparison group. Sometimes it's a comparison group of people who had wanted pregnancies. This is Dr. Vignetta Charles, who wrote an article. I'm going to try with this to show you how big a collaboration this study was. I'm putting pictures. Dr. Charles wasn't on this study, but she wrote the paper that I think is the best at laying out the methodological challenges in studying this. So among the problems are a lack of comparison group or the wrong comparison group, not controlling for baseline mental health problems. So for example, if people who are depressed are more likely to either more likely to have an unintended pregnancy or more likely to opt for abortion when pregnant, then you could have an association between abortion and depression that has nothing to do with abortion being the cause. There are various confounders. There's problems with how you measure mental health, selection bias, where Justice Kennedy got his bit of wisdom was from an amicus brief by people selected because they regretted their abortion. So is that representative? No, it isn't. So you really need to be careful about how you collect your data. So if you want more on that, read Dr. Charles's article. And the Turnaway Study was aimed to describe the mental health, physical health, and socioeconomic consequences of having an abortion versus being denied a wanted abortion. And how we did this study is we went to 30 abortion facilities across the United States, where if you're too far along for that facility, there's no other facility within 150 miles that will do an abortion later. So most of these sites had gestational limits in the second trimester, but 90% of people who get abortions do so in the first trimester. And so from each of these, we also collected, we recruited from each of these 3 types of people: those just over the gestational limit who were denied the abortion, those just under the limit, and I'll call those the near limit abortion group. And then because of most of these sites had limits in the second trimester, but most patients have abortions in the first trimester, we also included a sample of people who received their abortion in the first trimester because we wanted to know what their experience of the near limit group was typical. We excluded people who were seeking abortion for fetal anomaly or maternal health indications or maternal life indications, and that is because we thought that they very likely would get their abortion anyway and be referred for it, and therefore they would only end up in one of the study groups, i.e. those who received their abortion. And at the time I designed this study, I didn't know to not say the criteria for eligibility was pregnant women, and which I did. And therefore we don't have any trans men or non-binary people, and I'll refer to the people in the study as women. So we ended up with just under 1,000 women seeking abortion over 3 years, a quarter of whom were denied the abortion, half were just under the limit and received it, and then a quarter who were in the first trimester. And this ratio is by study design. We followed all of the women for 5 years, calling them every 6 months for interviews in English or Spanish. And at the very end, we did in-depth interviews with 30 people, 25 of them randomly selected so that we could hear their experiences in their own words. This was a collaboration of more than 40 scientists over a decade. Most at the University of California, but also with scientists at 8 other universities and 4 research institutes, including the amazing Dr. Sarah Miller. So here are the study limitations. About a quarter of the people who were denied abortions actually went on to get one elsewhere. And that's a concern because maybe the people that carried their pregnancy to term were somehow more accepting of the pregnancy than people who went and got one elsewhere. And maybe their outcomes wouldn't be as bad as if, because they're selected, that they didn't manage to get an abortion elsewhere. But when we look at actually how they feel about their pregnancy and other attributes, that those are not significant. What is different about them, the people who got an abortion elsewhere, is that we recruited them from sites that had lower gestational limits. And so there were places they could go. Also, agreement to participate in the study was about a third, which is similar to other longitudinal studies like the nurses study. And that would be a concern if people who were like happier with their abortion, more willing to talk about it, were more likely to participate. And we have a couple ways of checking whether their outcomes are different, whether we have selection bias. One is that when we compare the results among the places that were really good at recruiting women, like Fargo, North Dakota, and San Francisco, and New York for the first part of its recruitment, and we compare those to the sites, which I won't name, which had very low participation rates, we don't find differences in the outcomes. And the other is that when I've done studies that are completely anonymous in clinic waiting rooms where people fill out surveys, the percentage of people who, for example, say that they're gonna have trouble coping with their abortion is very similar than in this study where not everyone agreed to participate. So I am not concerned about the potential of selection bias. The study's strengths, one is that retention was high and it didn't vary by whether the person got an abortion or not. It was diverse and it really nearly exactly reflected the population of people who seek abortions nationally based on the Guttmacher data. And here's the most important thing, which is that the people who were just over the gestational limit and were denied and just under the gestational limit and received were very similar at baseline. And that's important because the whole idea is that by accident of where you went and what the gestational limit was at that site, you're assigned as randomly as ethically possible, which wouldn't be ethical to randomly assign people to abortion. So it's as close as you can get to random. We've gotten a group of people who got their abortions and were denied their abortions, and they're similar at baseline, and their outcomes diverge over time in ways that are attributable to whether they got their abortion or not. So first, before I get into the results, I want to talk about why anyone would show up late for an abortion. And on all these analyses, I'll try and show you who led the analysis and where you can find a paper on the topic. So why do people present late for abortion? Well, 90% of people who have abortions actually don't present late. They do so in the first trimester. But some people, that leaves about 10%, 8 to 10% of people who do get abortions after the first trimester. And so what slows people down? The first is not realizing they were pregnant, not knowing where to or how to get an abortion. And then the biggest that almost everyone names is time to raise the money to pay for the abortion or the travel costs. And then one thing that is absolutely not associated with delay, and I'll show you this graphically, is difficulty deciding. So it's not that the people who are later in seeking abortion are just somehow not sure that they want one. My colleague, Dr. Upadhyay, estimates that more than 4,000 people were denied abortions each year, and that was actually prior to many states putting in new gestational limits for abortion. Here's the graph I was promising. This is on the top row is the top bar is people who sought abortions after 20 weeks. The middle is people who were in the early second trimester, and the bottom is the first trimester. The two vertical lines, the first is conception. This is weeks since last menstrual period. So you're only going to conceive at about 2 weeks, and the earliest a pregnancy could be detected with a test is about 4 weeks. And you can see that if you're going to get a first trimester abortion, everything else better go really fast because there's not a lot of time. The red bar is the time to discover you're pregnant. And this is statistically significantly different among the three groups. The purple is time to decide, and that is not statistically different. The blue are all the logistical barriers of raising money and travel and finding a place that will do an abortion at your point in pregnancy. So let's take one quick look at why someone will be late in discovering they're pregnant. People report lack of pregnancy symptoms, conditions that have symptoms in common with pregnancy. For example, they've just given birth, and so their whole system is out of whack anyway, and they don't realize that the symptoms they're having is a new pregnancy. People with chronic conditions. Use of hormonal methods in the month of conception is statistically associated with late recognition, and that's because you thought you were protected and therefore you don't realize that you're pregnant. Also, some hormonal methods have symptoms that are in common with pregnancy, including not having a period. And then women who've never given birth before are more likely to be late in recognition. Things that are not associated are obesity, lack of education, poverty, or race, ethnicity. This slide is about the what analysis methods we did for the rest of these outcomes. We use multivariate models, mixed effects to take into account that there was clustered recruitment by site and multiple observations per woman. We included random intercepts. When the trend did not seem linear, as we tested it with quadratics, we added them. And we control for age and parity because of the things that were different at baseline. Women who were denied were slightly younger and slightly less likely to have had a child before, and we control for those differences. So looking at probably what is Justice Kennedy would think was the most important results, the mental health consequences of receiving or being denied an abortion by my colleague, Antonia Biggs. Here's a graph of depression symptoms over time. And you can see it's slightly elevated for both groups at the beginning, and over time, there's no statistically significant difference between the women who give birth and the women who receive an abortion just under the limit. And this is a surprise no matter what side of the debate you're on. You could think abortion hurts women. You could think that carrying an unwanted pregnancy to term would hurt women depression-wise, and neither of those is true. They both are associated with improvements over time. Suicidal ideation, also no difference, and low. Anxiety here, the women who were denied an abortion do have elevated anxiety for the first two observations and then not after that. People who are denied an abortion have lower self-esteem, quite contrary to Kennedy's assertion, and that also converges over time. So to sum up these mental health results is that women denied abortions had higher anxiety, lower self-esteem at the time of abortion denial, but the two groups, those receiving and those denied, converge by 6 to 12 months. No differences in depression, suicidal ideation, post-traumatic stress, or life satisfaction by study group. And for all the outcomes in study groups, women improved over time. And so from a policy perspective, denying women an abortion is more harmful, at least in the short term, than allowing her to get an abortion. And many states mandate that women be told that there's mental health harm from abortion, and those are not based in evidence. But just because people aren't depressed doesn't mean they don't have an emotional response to having been pregnant or having an abortion. So my colleagues, Dr. Raka and Kim Port, studied women's emotions. So this is, and here we'll get to the most famous statistic of the study. So this is people's emotions who received an abortion immediately after having received the abortion. So we asked them about 6 emotions, some of them negative and some of them positive, and asked them how much they're feeling each one. And a third of the people said they felt the positive emotions, about a quarter the negative emotions, a quarter said they weren't feeling these emotions, and about 1 in 5 said they're feeling both strong negative and strong positive emotions. Now, having a negative emotion doesn't mean that you don't think it's that you made the wrong decision. So when we look at people who had a negative emotional response, first of all, 95% of the people who received an abortion said it was the right decision for them. That's our most famous statistic. But even among people who said they were having negative emotions, 90% said that it was the right decision. And people who specifically endorsed the emotion regret also said it was 93% said it was the right decision, because you can feel regret that you were in the position where you needed an abortion, and it doesn't mean that you feel like you made the wrong decision in having one. My favorite graph, this is those same emotions, positive, negative, mixed, and none over time. And you can see that positive emotions go down over time, negative emotions go down over time. And what happens over time is that people say they stop thinking about the abortion. And one woman said, the only time I think about it is when you call me for these interviews. But there are some people who say that it wasn't the right decision. So we're trying to look at who it is who says that. And so this is, note I've stretched out the y-axis so that you can see the differences, because what is statistically associated with saying it was the right decision is if you said that it was a very difficult decision at the onset, then you're slightly less likely to say it was the right decision over time. And that makes sense, right? If you felt it was a difficult decision, you can continue to question that decision over time. Here is wishing that you had been able to have the abortion among the people that were denied. So at 1 week after being denied, 2/3 of them say, I still wish I could have had an abortion. It's by 6 months they've given birth, and 12% say they wish they could have had the abortion. By 5 years, it's about 4%. Fewer than 1 in 10 women who were turned away placed a child for adoption. And obviously this was not something the study set. We didn't randomize people to choosing to place for adoption. The finding here is that when people are denied an abortion, very few of them will choose to place the child for adoption. But those who do are more likely to say that they wish they still could have had an abortion. And that is also kind of to be expected when when you're caring for a child. It's probably harder to admit that you wish you still had an abortion, and also probably harder to actually feel it because you're now taking care of a child. But if you've placed a child for adoption, then maybe you are more likely to say that you wish you hadn't had the experience of pregnancy and birth. So turning to a different set of results, epidemiologists Ralph and Gertz looked at how receiving or being denied a wanted abortion affected physical health. The medical literature is completely clear that carrying a pregnancy to term and giving birth is much more physically dangerous than having an abortion, even a later abortion. These results are consistent with that. This is the first row is limitations on daily activities in days. And you can see that people who gave birth reported longer periods of physical disability compared to people who received a second trimester or a first trimester abortion. People are equally likely to report side effects, but the severity of those side effects is very different. Much more likely to be potentially life-threatening if you gave birth than if you received an abortion. And examples of the kinds of conditions people reported. We also asked people to rate their physical health before they became pregnant, then at each interview. And this question about how do you rate your physical health is actually highly predictive of morbidity and mortality. And here's the data. The blue is the women denied an abortion, and they're significantly more likely over 5 years to report poor or fair physical health compared to people who receive abortions. And this is kind of surprising because one wouldn't necessarily know that having a given birth would have such long-term effects. We know that the short-term consequences of an abortion versus birth are more risky for people who give birth, but this longer term is surprising. When we look at specific chronic conditions, gestational hypertension is more likely if you've given birth than if you received an abortion. And note, this is not just the index pregnancy where the woman was denied an abortion. Many of the women had subsequent pregnancies. When we ask about different kinds of chronic pain, the top 3 all show statistically higher chronic pain for women who gave birth compared to women who receive abortions. And then turning to the most surprising and sad results of the study, we actually, after we were done data collection, went and looked for death records to see if any of the women who didn't continue to participate in the study had died. We found 8 deaths among people in the study. 4 of them were people who gave birth. So 4 among the Turnaway group and 4 among the people who received a second trimester. But of the 4 Turnaway deaths, 2 of them were maternal deaths. They died because they gave birth. They died from pregnancy-related causes. We found their death certificates, and their death was directly attributable to having been denied that abortion and given birth. And actually one of them we didn't find through death records. We found because the woman's mother called us to say she'd been going through her daughter's papers and she'd found our study and she wanted us to know that her daughter was gone, which is really sad. They both had given birth, so there was a child there. Also, one of them had older children. So these are just tragedies. It's a way higher maternal mortality rate than we would have expected, but it is consistent with the larger risks of childbirth over abortion. So to sum up the physical health findings, women who were denied an abortion and gave birth were more likely to experience gestational hypertension, several kinds of chronic pain, and report poor or fair health over time. No differences in outcomes between people having earlier and later abortions, and deaths due to maternal causes were just way more common than we would have expected. So let's turn our attention to the socioeconomic consequences. I led one paper and Dr. Miller here led the other. So I'll do mine first. So this is based on the interviews with women reporting that their household is below the federal poverty level. The shaded areas are areas where it's not statistically significant. So at baseline, they're not statistically significant, but over time, in fact, immediately upon giving birth, women who are denied an abortion are more likely to be living below the federal poverty level, and it lasts for 4 years. They're more likely to report objective poverty, subjective poverty. This is reporting they don't have enough money to pay for basic living needs like food, housing, and transportation. Shoot, I really cut a bunch of slides. Anyway, we find differences in public assistance, but they're more likely to receive public assistance, but it's not enough to mitigate the loss of full-time employment. And I'm sorry, I meant to have the slides about raising children, but women over time are more likely to be raising their children alone, not with family members and not with the male partner. When I published that paper in the American Journal of Public Health, I got a cold call email from Sarah Miller from Michigan to say she had a really good idea of what I ought to do with my data. We ought to match the women in the study with their credit reports. So credit agencies, I should just turn it over to her, but I'm not gonna, haha. Credit agencies keep a record of people's financial well-being. They don't know if you've become pregnant. They don't know if you've given birth. It's an objective measure, and there's no loss to follow up because as long as you've got a credit report, they're counting it. And it counts things like how much debt you have, whether you've declared bankruptcy, whether you've been evicted. And this is what she finds. Oh, the other cool thing besides it being objective is that you can get people's records from long before the pregnancy because these are all archived data. And you can follow them past the time that they would be in your study, and certainly whether they drop out, they still have credit reports. So she finds that in the 3 years prior to the pregnancy, the women who were received abortion and were denied an abortion were the same. But after the pregnancy, the two groups diverge and don't converge within the 5 years that she's able to follow. And this is actually in some ways conservative because she's counting everyone turned away, regardless of whether we have data from them about whether they gave birth. So anyone who got an abortion elsewhere is actually included in the Turnaway group here. It's not Turnaway births, it's anyone who was originally denied an abortion. And she just got this published or accepted in a fancy journal. So ask her questions at the end. Turning to another set of results, this is what happens to women's existing children when they are denied or receive an abortion, and we published this in the Journal of Pediatrics. Just background information, the majority of women who have abortions are already mothers. It's about 60%. And about half of women who are mothers give their desire to take care of their existing children as their reason for wanting to end an unwanted pregnancy. And so we show there are large differences in poverty. This is consistent with the women's own outcomes, but an existing child is much more likely to be raised in a household below the federal poverty level if their mom is denied the abortion than if their mom receives it, and more likely to live in a household where there isn't enough money for basic living expenses. Other differences have to do with child development. This is from a scale called the PEDS-DM that we included. It's intended for pediatrics offices. It's about developmental milestones by age. So can your 3-year-old climb steps by themselves? Can your 6-month-old make eye contact? I made those up, but that's the kind of questions they are, and on 6 realms of development. And so we asked women about their existing children and about all subsequent children, whether their child was achieving these 6 realms of child development, of developmental milestones. And we find that all of them, the existing children of women who were denied an abortion were worse off than women who received an abortion. And they're not individually significant, but they're jointly significant across the 6 areas of development. Turning to a different set of children, this is the well-being of children who were born because their mom was denied an abortion. They exist because their mom was denied an abortion. Well, who do we compare those kids to? Well, many of the women, about 40% of women who are seeking abortions nationally, want more children later. They just don't want that child then. The circumstances, their financial situation, the relationship, their health, they don't feel like they want to carry this pregnancy to term, but it's not that they never want to have a kid. So we actually looked at all the subsequent children born to women who received their abortions. So really, this is like the benefits of having control over the timing of your kids. If you're forced to have this pregnancy carried to term now, compared to being able to choose to have a pregnancy carried to term within 5 years, not even a long wait. So this is from the London Measure of Unplanned Pregnancy. And it is shows you in green, these are the children born because the mom was denied an abortion. To the left is more unplanned and to the right is more planned. And the blue is subsequent children. Children born subsequent to the woman receiving her wanted abortion. And you can see that their subsequent children are much more likely to have been born from a planned pregnancy, although there's still a range. And when we look at other outcomes, we looked at postpartum bonding questionnaire. This is a British scale of 12 items, and you're supposed to say how you feel about your child on these 12 items. And women who reporting about the index child are more likely to report worse bonding than they are to people who receive an abortion to their subsequent child. So they're more likely to have poor bonding from a child born because the woman was denied an abortion than a subsequent child born to a woman who received an abortion. And these scores are consistently worse across all 12 items. And just to give you an example of the kinds of items that people are reporting on, I wish the old days when I had no baby would come back. The baby stresses me out. I feel trapped as a mother. Looking at health, we find that index children have almost twice the odds of an injury in the past 6 months, serious enough to consider getting medical attention. No differences in birth outcomes, in physical disabilities, asthma, or breastfeeding. sorry, and one more difference that isn't on this is that index children are more likely to be born after a short birth interval. I told you that sometimes people don't realize they're pregnant because they just gave birth. Well, these index children were more likely to be born within a year and a half of a previous child than a subsequent child. Looking at socioeconomic differences, again, index children are more likely to be raised with other adult family members in lower poverty households and in households where there's not enough money to meet basic living needs, and less likely to be raised in a household with a male adult. No difference in receipt of public assistance. So in conclusion, all the differences that we observe, maternal bonding, injuries, socioeconomics, are to the detriment of the child born because the mom was denied an abortion compared to children born subsequent to receiving an abortion. And so the policy implications are that access to abortion enables women to have children when they have both the financial and emotional resources to devote to their children. And a couple quotes from people in the study. An 18-year-old in California who was denied the abortion said, "I wish I had her when I was older, more stable, more financially set, just pretty much to where I knew who I was, because it was like raising her and trying to figure me out. But I was raising both of us, myself and her." And then this woman, she had just had a birth when she found out she was pregnant and managed to get the abortion. So by having that abortion, she avoided a short birth interval. And what she says is it would have been probably the worst thing for that child to come into this world because it would never have had the support it needed. I wasn't mentally stable for that child. And she had a subsequent child within the 5 years. So she says, "I do have a 1-year-old now and I'm able to support myself, able to support my kids and know the timing is right. Financially now it all makes sense, but to have 12 months apart without that abortion, there's just no way life would be where I am right now if I had kept that child." Looking at some other outcomes, but not doing justice to them, my colleague, Dr. Upadhyay, showed that women who receive an abortion are more likely to have an intended pregnancy in the subsequent 5 years than women who are denied, a rate of about 7.5% per year versus 2% per year. And then she looked also at relationships and found, so at the beginning I asked about, I thought when designing the study to ask about the relationship with the man involved in the pregnancy, whether she was still with that man, and then what the quality of that relationship was, because I really thought that relationships, that people would be more likely to stay together, even maybe in a bad relationship, if they were denied an abortion and had a baby. And only 2 years in did we realize we weren't asking about all their relationships, only the man involved in the pregnancy. So at 2 years, we added questions about, are you in any romantic relationship and what's the quality? And so she found actually that women are equally likely to be in a romantic relationship at 2 years, but they're more likely to be in a high quality romantic relationship if they receive their abortion. I'm going to get to the relationship with the man involved, I think, on the next slide. Okay, on the next one after this. So we also asked at the end of every interview what their plans were for the coming year and what their plans were for the next 5 years, because there's a fantastic study out of Johns Hopkins that looked at women young African-American women who chose abortion versus birth, their educational attainment. And people who chose abortion were more likely to have educational attainment, graduate. But it seemed to me that we should ask people to set their own goals for the future. And so we had an open-ended, where do you see your life in a year? Where do you see your life in 5 years? And then we categorize those plans as aspirational, neutral, or negative. So someone could say, I want to graduate from high school, or I want to get a better job. Or they could say, I don't see any difference, or it's going to be really hard. And those would be examples of neutral versus negative aspirations. So my colleague, Dr. Upadhyay, showed that women who receive an abortion are more likely to set and achieve aspirational plans in the coming year. Molly McCarthy, who was a doctoral student at University of Nebraska, analyzed the data on 5-year plans and found that women who receive first of all, everyone is much more likely to have an aspirational plan for 5 years than they do for 1 year. And women who receive an abortion are more likely to set aspirational plans for the 5 years. My colleague, Dr. Lauren Ralph, showed that there are no differences in graduation or dropping out of school by whether they receive or are denied an abortion, but those who receive an abortion get more advanced degrees. And we haven't gone nuts with this finding because we know that the women who were denied abortions were younger. So they're partly getting less advanced degrees because they were more likely to be in high school as opposed to college at the beginning. And some hope of continuing work with Dr. Miller to see if we can link them to educational outcomes over time, to give them more than just 5 years to achieve degrees. And then my colleague, Dr. Roberts, looked at some of the relationship data, and I don't have that explicitly on this graph, but women are no more likely to stay with the man involved in the pregnancy if they get an abortion or they're denied an abortion, which is really, I think, surprising for many people, and less surprising if you realize that people often give the reason for abortion is they have a poor relationship with the man involved. That's their reason for abortion. So we shouldn't be surprised that these relationships dissolve, whether they get an abortion or not. Dr. Roberts showed that women who have abortions experience a sharp decrease in violence from the man involved in the pregnancy, and women who carry the pregnancy to term have no decrease. And it's about 1 in 20 women actually report violence from the man involved in the pregnancy in the 6 months prior to conception. And my favorite quote from the study, this woman was profiled at length in the book. She tells her whole story. She's super smart and her life is a mess. And she was denied an abortion, was unable to take care of that kid, and her mom stepped in and adopted the kid. So she said to us, it's very, very difficult to find a job when you're pregnant, to keep a job when you're pregnant, or find and maintain a job with a baby, especially if your partner doesn't want to help. So domestic violence skyrockets because you're financially dependent on your partner because you have to be home with the kid, where you're like, I can't be homeless with this kid. I need him for money. Pregnancy is an incredibly scary thing if you cannot trust the person you're with. So in conclusion, the Turnaway Study demonstrates effective access to abortion on their women's mental health, physical health, the well-being of their family, and the trajectory of their lives. We find that abortion doesn't harm or help women's mental health in the long run. Women are emotionally resilient, but abortion is associated with improved physical health, financial security, aspirational plans, and ability to take care of future and existing children. Sorry for waving my camera. So the question is, could we have foreseen these results? Are these just random results? And we asked women at baseline. See, in a paper, you can't give new results in the conclusions, but in talks you can. So we asked people at baseline, what are your reasons for wanting to end this pregnancy? And people told us, we didn't say, here, pick acceptable reasons from this list. We just left it open-ended, and we later went through the mess of categorizing people's reasons. And what it boils down to is completely consistent with national data from other sources that show the leading reasons are people feel like they can't afford to have a child right then, or another child right then. It's not the right time for a child. They have partner-related reasons. They need to focus on their other children. They have other opportunities that this would interfere with. They don't feel emotionally prepared, and health-related reasons. And in case you snooze through the rest of the talk, these are exactly the outcomes we find. We find that people are they are more likely to become poor. They are better able to bond with a child born later. Their relationships don't last, whether they receive or are denied that abortion. They're more able to take care of their existing children, and less able to achieve, and more able to achieve other hopes when they, aspirations when they receive a wanted abortion. And so from a policy perspective, I think this idea that women are making decisions at the baseline about their pregnancies and all of their concerns are borne out in the experiences of people who are denied an abortion indicates that people are making careful decisions for themselves. They understand the circumstances of their lives, they're weighing their responsibilities, and they're making decisions that are right for themselves and their families. So in case you haven't had enough, there's a book. It's about why we needed the study, how we did the study, and then profiles 10 women from the study to tell their stories in their words. The only thing we did editing those stories was to make, sometimes people would say, oh yeah, and one more thing I want to tell you about, and we'd move everything chronologically and cut out the ums. But otherwise, it's in their words. I think it's probably the best part of the book, but maybe you'll like the science too. So please check out the book. It's even available in paperback now. I want to thank the funders, the facilities, and who recruited for us, and the women who took time to share their stories. It was a huge group of people that helped carry out this study, and researchers who helped analyze the data. I should have had Sarah Miller on here. Please feel free to email me if you have questions that you're unable to ask here in this seminar.
Oh, thank you so much. That was just fantastic, a really elegant presentation of your very rigorous science and terrific findings. So I will turn things over to the audience for questions. You can post, you can just unmute yourself or post questions in the chat if you like. Okay, if we don't have anybody.
Okay, I'm going to comment on Sarah's comment. She wrote that I was willing to work with an economist. I was so thrilled to work with an economist, because if you read the paper that Sarah wrote and with Laura Wary, it's beautiful, and it's so different than demographers write papers, and it's so sophisticated. I even participated in some forum for economists where Sarah was presenting and Laura and I were madly answering questions. And the demographers are such a lovely bunch compared to economists, except for, of course, Sarah and Laura, but it was brutal. And so people wanting to, come up with just wanting to challenge. And people, I think, accepted the study, and they still wanted to give us pages of comments about it, which I would have ignored, and Sarah patiently responded to. So it was like this whole total cultural change. I feel like demographers are, you can give a talk where people are engaged and challenged, but it's not at all the same level of energy that you find in economists. And just the interactions with the journal editors was so radically different, and made me feel like we are a warm, fuzzy bunch, we demographers.
Barbara has her hand up, but Sarah, would you like to take a moment?
I was just going to say, I assume that's why Paula laid the ground rules for the talk, is just in case there were any we can be a contentious bunch, but I learned so much from Diana. Thank you for agreeing to collaborate with me. It was such an awesome experience. So.
And just in case I seem like I was being negative, what Sarah and Laura produced is beautiful and rigorous and really smart. And so I'm not saying that the economist approach is always bad, but it is a little brutal.
It's definitely different, yeah.
All right, thanks. Barbara, your question?
Well, I just wanted to say something perhaps obvious, that this was incredibly interesting and very important for science and for policy. I mean, I'm just saying things that were obvious to everybody. I mean, we refute so many of the common arguments out there, which people just accept as a matter of course. And it's very important, your work, and very important for it to get disseminated. And thanks a lot.
My pleasure. Dr. Anderson mentioned at the beginning the work of Henry David, who was a demographer who was also typified how nice demographers are. That guy was the nicest guy ever. He did a study working with Czech scientists to look at people who were denied abortions in what was then Czechoslovakia between 1962 and 1963. To get an abortion, you needed to go up in front of a hospital committee and have it approved. So he found the people who had been not approved, and he followed not the women, but their children for 35 years. And no, he wasn't calling them with interviews in Czech every 6 months. He was using records from their health system, their criminal system, their housing system to look at the outcomes of these children. And he found that particularly the boys born, he called them born unwanted. And I have a little bit of a question about that. But the kids who were born from these unwanted pregnancies did worse than kids who were born in the same hospital at the same time, including particularly the boys, and even showing things like psychological problems over time and more likely to be incarcerated. So it was a pretty important study. I would question the born unwanted because in our study, people by the time they're giving birth have mostly acclimated. So it's not that the child was unwanted, the pregnancy was unwanted, but that's a small beef for what's really important study.
I have a question. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. No, please go ahead, Anne.
Okay, so I was curious about the people who had difficulty deciding. I thought it was really interesting that, you know, the people who had abortions later, it wasn't because they had difficulty deciding, but you obviously did have people with difficulty deciding in your study. So, and it seemed like it was a relatively small number. So I don't know if there's enough of them to really characterize what they were like and how they were different from other people. But I'm particularly interested, because you have qualitative data, if there's anything you can tell us about their decision-making process, in addition to, you know, how they differed from folks in other ways. Thanks.
Yeah, that is super interesting question. Off the top of my head, I'm not going to remember, but I can send you the paper on decision-making. It's about half the people said it was a hard or very hard decision. I think there's some, social expectation there that you're not necessarily able to say it was an easy decision. So I think it may be something of an overcount, but just because it was a hard decision doesn't mean people took a long time to do it. And so there just wasn't a big difference in time. And really what slowed people down was not the decision-making, but a late discovery of pregnancy followed by a ton of logistical barriers that get greater if you're late, because you have to travel farther to get an abortion, pay more money, raise more money. But the difficulty deciding piece, we didn't find big differences that you might expect by religiosity or race ethnicity, but I will send you the data. I think sometimes people, they are weighing their circumstances, and sometimes their circumstances make it so clear what the right decision is. And so we did this other study where we looked at people's exposure to protesters at the clinic. And the more contact people had with protesters, the more upsetting they found it. But it had no difference in how they actually felt about their abortion months later. And that, I think, it's another example where your circumstances outweigh the social messaging or even your initial hesitancy, because their own circumstances and responsibilities are more important than these outside factors. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, thank you. That's super interesting.
Did you say me?
Yep.
Oh, okay. Hi. I just got off a 10-hour flight, so I'm gonna remain camera off. Hi. First of all, this talk was so interesting. I am not a demographer. I am an anthropologist based at Yale University, and I was really interested in the way you were talking about like the ethnographic or qualitative data that you were including and these qualitative accounts that were women's own voices. And it sounds like in your book, which I really want to read, these vignettes, you know, feature heavily. And I'm really interested in hearing your thoughts about how, like, how do you think about the relationship between your, you know, very quantitative work, which is telling a very important story, and then this very qualitative work, which is adding to the story in a very important way? You know, what are these two different types of data doing for you in this work?
That's such a great question that I've never been asked, but I have tons of thoughts about. I really I'm not a qualitative scientist. Those stories haven't been analyzed in a way that would, you know, that any qualitative scientist would approve of. I really just wanted there to be a story from women directly that wasn't translated through my research questions and my choice of measures. And also, I can boil people's emotions down to how much do you agree that you felt regret, relief, anger, happiness, etc. But that does not do justice to the range that of emotions that people feel or their circumstances. And so it really needed, you know, when we boil everything down to whether the averages go up or down, it just doesn't tell you everything about the range of people's experiences. And so these stories, and 10 women also don't do the range justice either, but they at least give you a window into how complicated things really are. And as I said, I'm not a qualitative scientist, and so I got a qualitative colleague, Katrina Kimport, to like give me advice. How do I pick the women? And I wanted to go through, we have tons of open-ended questions in this survey. I wanted to go through and hand pick out all the people who gave really juicy quotes, and let's go and talk to them because they really must have something to say. And she's like, oh, no, you cannot do that. Why don't you just start with a random sample and see if you need to like follow up and get more of some particular experience? So we did what she said, and we did 25 people randomly, and you just would not believe or you would, but quantitative people might not believe just the range of voices and the range of experience and the strength of personality that you get from just having someone tell about their experiences with really bland prompts like, what were you thinking at the time you became pregnant? And so from those 25 random ones, we just had I didn't even include, there were beautiful things that I couldn't even include, beautiful stories that didn't even make it into the book. But we then went and got everyone, after doing 25 random people and feeling like we had such a beautiful range of experiences, we also went and tried to get everybody who placed a child for adoption, because that was an underrepresented viewpoint because it just rarely happened. And we weren't super successful in getting those, but we have a couple.
Thank you. Yeah, no, that's and I, as an anthropologist, I will say I wouldn't even know how to do a random sample. So I definitely choose the juiciest stories, and I completely approve of your data. And you said no qualitative scientist would love it, and I disagree. I love it. So, and I'm definitely going to reach out to you because I'd love to talk to you more about this. So thank you so much.
My pleasure.
We have a comment from Sarah.
So I just wanted to say I can't wait to bring pieces of the book into my course. I teach a big intro class on sociology for folks taking the MCAT that want to be medical care providers. And I think that this mix of evidence is going to be incredibly powerful and accessible for folks who don't have a social science background, but also quite convincing and quite interpretable for folks who aren't, super technically inclined either in the way that a lot of us quantitative social scientists work. So I just wanted to thank you, Diana, and all of your colleagues for just this outstanding, accessible, deeply important work. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I would love it if you share it. I was trying to think, if you're completely opposed to abortion, I don't think this study has much for you. You can realize that people's outcomes are worse and still think it's the right thing to deny people abortions. but who might be swayed are the people who are kind of uncomfortable and feel like it's a political issue that's something that they're not that interested in because it seems so political. They're not opposed, but they just kind of feel like it's messy. And to like give agency to the women making the decision, that they're making their own decisions and that their outcomes are measurable, I feel like people that might make a difference would be professionals like doctors and lawyers who are moved by data and who may not think about this topic outside of a political arena.
Okay, well, I think I'll wrap things up here just so we have a little bit of time for our professional development conversation with trainees. So thank you to everybody for attending today. I invite our pre-doc and postdoc trainees to stay on for a bit, and everybody else, I hope we will see you next week for Mike Miller-Schmidt's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we have a group staying on. So I mentioned before, I'm going to turn off the recording.